Hello world! My name is Hristina Crenn, a webinar intern for OneHealthLessons.com. Today I have the absolute privilege to talk with Dr. Thomas Mather from Rhode Island, from the USA. Hello, Dr. Mather. How are you doing today?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. You are a specialist in the domain of tick-borne diseases. Before we start with questions, could you please briefly present yourself and tell us more about your academic and professional background?
Well, as a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin, I worked on a mosquito-borne virus infection called La Crosse virus. But I had the opportunity, just as I was finishing up, to join a colleague on a early in the Lyme disease epidemic tick collecting trip. And I found it very interesting. And so when I had an opportunity to look for where I was going to go do my work after my doctoral degree, I had a few opportunities, and one of them was at the Harvard School of Public Health to study aspects, ecological aspects around this, something at the time in 1983 was just names without much knowledge, called Lyme disease. And so I was fortunate to sort of come into this study of tick-borne diseases through Lyme disease, which has become sort of a world-known infection and is linked inextricably with ticks. And so when people think ticks, they think Lyme disease first and foremost. And then after that, there's a lot of things that they don't know. And so over the past, since 1983, so I don't even know how many years that is, but it's a lot, I've been focusing my work on understanding where does the Lyme disease germ come from? How does it put people at risk? Are there ways to reduce that risk so that fewer people get the Lyme disease germ and are affected by the disease that that germ causes? In the meantime, we've learned that the same ticks that transmit the Lyme disease germ transmit many other germs as well. And so a lot of our work has been to understand a few of these other germs. Do they maintain themselves in the same way as the Lyme disease germ, or are there different things that are going on as well? And so it's been quite a fascinating path for me that has led me into trying to figure out novel tick control strategies to reduce the number of ticks that people are exposed to look at potential ways to vaccinate people to protect them against tick-borne diseases, and also to focus on sort of what we call research extension or outreach, which really is about building people's knowledge base and awareness of ticks and tick-borne diseases so that they are better armed to protect themselves. I mean, so that there's a lot of things that, most people don't like to think about ticks all of the time. Well, it turns out I think about ticks all of the time. And so it's good for people like me, like tick experts like me, to be part of society so that we can share our expertise about something that most people don't know. I mean, I have written a blog, and that blog says that everyone knows something about ticks. They oftentimes, though, what they know about ticks isn't really completely correct. And if they go by their slightly incorrect notion of it, about ticks, then they may be making wrong decisions about how to protect themselves or what their risks are or something. And so a lot of our focus is to have people be mostly right about ticks rather than mostly a little bit wrong.
You're absolutely right. In the region where I'm living, mainly or more precisely in Southeast Europe, when we think of ticks, we often think about Lyme disease, and we think that Lyme disease it's an incurable disease, basically. So that means that this is, just the common doctrine or the common statement that is circulating among people's general opinion. And that also signifies that there is not a sufficient information provided to the public audience regarding this type of tick-borne diseases, or more precisely, Lyme disease. Um, I was wondering if there are other types of tick-borne diseases except the Lyme one that we mentioned already.
Well, sure. So you're in Turkey right
Yes.
now, and
Yes.
you have a tick there called hyaloma. That's the genus name. And hyaloma is associated with transmitting a very deadly viral disease called Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever. And so that's not Lyme disease, but it's probably far more dangerous than Lyme disease, right? But maybe you've never heard of that
Never.
before. And so one of the things that I think people need to understand, they need to, a lot of times people will ask me in an interview, well, how bad are ticks going to be this year? Because they lump it all together, but there are many different types of ticks. There are over 700 species of ticks across the world, and each one of them is not the same as the other. And that's the first place. So when someone says, how bad are ticks going to be this year? Let's say they're asking me that for the United States. I've learned that we have to unpack that. I have to say to them, well, which tick do you mean? And where are you worried about? Like, because what's going on in California is going to be different than what's going on the East Coast, because there are different species of ticks. The ecology of those ticks and their hosts and the germs that they might carry are quite a bit different. And so it's really important to start to take a deeper dive, break it down a little bit to, so are we talking about Lyme disease? Are we talking about Lyme disease in the Northeastern United States? Okay, I can tell you something about that. If you're talking about Lyme disease in the Southeastern United States, it's a completely different picture. I mean, there are some elements that are the same, but for instance, even in that situation, the infection rate in the ticks is quite a bit different. It ranges from 50% of the ticks, so 1 in 2 ticks in the Northeast carry the germ that causes Lyme disease, to in Florida, only about 1 in 20 ticks carries the Lyme disease germ. So the risk is different. The likelihood that someone's going to actually get infected is different, and it relates to basically the deeper underlying ecology of the disease. Where does the germ come from? And so that really, I think, is an important piece to this. Where does the Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever virus come from in Turkey? Well, easiest to say, it comes from hyaloma ticks. Well, where did the hyaloma ticks get it? So you have to go back and say, okay, well, what is the reservoir host of the Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever? And how is it that it moves from that reservoir host to affect people and their livestock?
Absolutely.
Those are really the essence, I think, of this whole concept of One Health, where, what affects livestock potentially affects people. What affects rodents, maybe it doesn't even affect rodents, but they serve as the reservoir, and it all may start there. Or let's say species of birds. And how then does this germ that affects people sort of move through nature to actually impact people? I think that really becomes the essence of the One Health mission.
Yes, and this question of the incurability of the Lyme disease that is circulating in the region where I am living, it is a very problematic issue, because people are not having, as I said, sufficient information about some peculiar type of tick-borne diseases. And perhaps your answer also relates to the actually to the saying of David Quammen in his famous book Spillover, where he says actually that everything comes from somewhere. So basically, if everything comes from somewhere, we must admit that For instance, some peculiar types of ticks are provoking the Lyme disease, but not all of them. And the same for COVID-19 nowadays. You know, like we think originally that COVID-19 it was transmitted from bats. This was the primary theory. But in this region where I'm living again, many people think that COVID-19 is a political propaganda. But beyond that, my question will be more related to know, how can we relate the tick-borne diseases to One Health? Like, why it is so important to One Health? All of this, what we have been speaking until now.
I'm going to try and frame that question just a little bit differently.
Absolutely.
And that is, how can One Health help us understand tick-borne diseases?
Absolutely.
And I think that that really gets at the essence of what David Quammen is talking about when everything comes from somewhere. So in the first chapter of his book, he's looking at a viral infection that moved from bats through horses to impact people. But people could handle the bats and they never got sick. So the bats were carrying the germ, but it wasn't for whatever reason, they weren't able to infect people directly. But if the bats exposed horses to that virus, and then horses exposed people, people got sick. Other horses got sick. And so that talked about a lesson of something that we would call an amplifier host. So if you didn't understand where something came from, so it actually came from the bats, but it only became a medical problem after it came through horses. So that's really important. But to control it, we have to understand, we have to go all the way down the chain to where it came from. It came from bats. And so that's the same thing with tick-borne diseases. We ask this question, all right, so let's take Lyme disease as an example. Where does it come from? So some of our earliest work found that animals, and we call those animals reservoirs. So the reservoir host of a germ is where that germ has naturally adapted itself to survive. And in the case of Lyme disease, one of the principal reservoir hosts are little mice. So a bunch of different types of rodents can be reservoirs, but for the most part, white-footed mice are the principal reservoir. All right, and the Lyme disease bacteria only wants to survive. It doesn't care about making people sick. It doesn't care about making dogs sick. It just wants to survive. Somehow, to survive, it has to live and adapt, not to be thrown out by the mouse's immunity, but it has to stay as an infection from mouse to mouse to mouse to mouse. That's great. And it would work out just fine if that's where it stayed. But unfortunately, in this situation, it turns out that we have so when we think about spillover, germs spill over from nature. So Lyme disease in nature is in, let's say, these rodents. And in order for it to cause disease in people, it has to go from rodents to people. Well, maybe, maybe there's no good way, but it turns out ticks make a good way. So we call those animals spillover agents. And so when they bite mice, they then potentially pick up the germ. And later in their life cycle, they may bite people and they can then transmit the germ. But not all ticks can do that. So there's many different species of ticks, and some ticks are capable of fishing that germ out of the mice, propagating it at enough of an infection level so that then when they bite again to take another blood meal, they can transmit the bacteria to the next host. Other ticks can't fish that germ out, or they can fish it out of the mice, but the germ doesn't survive in that tick. So what we see in that sort of whole scenario, what's revealed is that there's some very specific relationships that form between microorganisms like bacteria and these ticks. And so some ticks can be able to transmit it. We call that vector competence. So a tick is a vector. It's moving something from one place to another. And some of them are competent to do it, and some of them are not competent to do it. So as we start to unravel this, our understanding of tick-borne diseases, we get to learn a few other things. So things become revealed. And so the way I like to think of it, everything comes from somewhere. Researchers have started to understand that. So things have been revealed to those researchers. They look at this with deeper insight to see what the meaning is. They then try and consider all of the things together, like, okay, something about rodents, and then something about spillover agents that we call ticks in this case, and the germs that are spilling over from the natural reservoir to where it affects public health. That's a very broad spectrum, and so we have to consider all of those things, and then we can get a sort of to a level of a takeaway. What's our takeaway? Well, the takeaway is if we had less spillover agents, less ticks in this case, we would have less disease. And so a lot of our focus in Lyme disease is to reduce the number of ticks that either pick up the germ from the mice or bite people to transmit it. And so that's in a nutshell, sort of an example of starting with the concept of David Quammen. Everything comes from somewhere. Okay, the Lyme disease germ comes from mice. It spills over to affect people. And it does that because of one type of tick that has developed this relationship with the bacteria so that the bacteria can survive and be transmissible.
Indeed, and thank you very much for explaining the interdependence between One Health and tick-borne diseases, because it is a very technical field for especially people who are from the more focused on social sciences like I am. So for me, this is all of this is very interesting. So I think that, as you said, that mainly research it is the primary importance in this field, and I know that from my own personal experience that conducting a research in France mainly, it is a very expensive procedure because laboratories are not funded by the government regarding peculiar type of diseases such as the Lyme disease, for instance. So there are different organizations that are organizing donations, etc., etc. So my last question for this interview is perhaps if you can tell us more, if is it really difficult to conduct a research in the field of tick-borne diseases in the United States? Like from your own experience, what you can tell us about that?
Well, I have been fortunate to be blessed with the opportunity to have focused my research in areas where there has been reasonable grant money. So as an academic researcher at the University of Rhode Island or any university, generally speaking, we have to apply for grants from government agencies, and the amount of money that is set aside by our federal government in the United States and in many governments across the world has been really insufficient to move the needle for complete understanding and solution of tick-borne disease problems. There is some money, and I've been fortunate to acquire and use a lot of the given resources. But when we think about other health issues, certainly, I mean, who knows how it's going to be with the COVID, but look back to HIV. Sure, it was a huge public health impact for societies all around the world, but in the United States, billions of dollars have been put forward over 30 or 40 years to try and get to a point where now we actually have hope for victims. They have drugs, there are strategies to protect them, but it's taken a huge investment. When we think about tick-borne diseases, that investment can be counted in millions of dollars a year, not billions. And so you can just imagine that that sort of restricts the speed at which we can acquire this needed knowledge about how to, develop strategies that might actually result in a lower public health impact.
Indeed, and I truly hope that this interview will create an awareness, not just for governments or policymakers, because sometimes, as I am working and studying in the field of social sciences, I think it is very important such information to be transmitted to the legislators, like or the policymakers, because they are the ones who approve such grants or who craft basically some rules regarding research funding, etc., etc. So I truly hope that this interview will inspire people who work in the field of social sciences and One Health as well to give more importance to in the field of to tick-borne diseases and basically the research part of this project. It was a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you very much, Professor, and hopefully to talk soon to you. And thank you once again for this incredible speech of yours.
Well, thanks for your time today.
You're welcome. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Bye.